Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book. I'm Elizabeth Ferry. I'm back from a hiatus and serving as a guest producer and guest host on Recall This Book, and delighted to be here. My co-host today is our very own John Plotz. Hello, John.
Hello.
And we're really...
I don't like hearing you call yourself a guest host. What does that mean?
Yes,
Once a host, always a host.
Okay.
Just ask the church.
Yes, transubstantiated into a host for today.
Good.
And we're really excited to be joined by Dr. Ieva Jusionyte to talk about her recent book, Exit Wounds: How America's Guns Fuel Violence Across the Border. It was published by the University of California Press in 2024, and just this week it's been recognized as a finalist for the Juan Mendez Book Prize at the Duke Center for Human Rights.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you.
No doubt the first of many prizes and recognitions to come. So thanks so much, Ieva, for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Ieva is a professor at Brown University. She has a degree in anthropology from Brandeis University. She's a legal and medical anthropologist, and she's also worked as a journalist, a volunteer firefighter, and an emergency medical technician. Exit Wounds is her third book. So we'd love to start off, Ieva, by you just telling us a little bit about how you came to this topic and about the book itself.
Okay, how many years do I start back? So this book is... I would call it a multi-sided ethnography nonfiction book about firearms trafficking from the United States to Mexico, and also the history and different meaning of guns in the United States and in Mexico, and how they relate to migration and to somewhat to drug addiction and drug smuggling as well. So this is this like vicious circle of violence. How I came to it was quite a serendipity. I was on the U.S.-Mexico border in southern Arizona doing fieldwork for my previous book with emergency responders. So I was crossing the border back and forth almost every day. I was volunteering as a paramedic and firefighter in Mexico and in Arizona. And I was passing through, the border sometimes twice a day. Mm-hmm. And I didn't immediately pay attention to the signs that say bringing guns and ammunition to Mexico is a crime, you can go to prison. You kind of don't think about it. You are much more concerned about what you can't bring into the United States. So it took me a little while to begin asking questions. I didn't know that gun laws in Mexico were so different. I didn't know that most guns recovered in crime scenes in Mexico, over 70% and probably more, come from the United States. And then I was already there. I was already an ethnographer. I was interested in borders and as sites of state violence for my past few projects. And I just became very curious, and I thought I would like to pursue this and follow the guns south. So yeah, that's what the book is about. I hang out with various people in Mexico who use and who buy guns from the United States. There is also part of the book that is about journalists. There is another part of the book So the book is really comprised of these storylines that are braided storylines. I'm trying to look at the issue of gun trafficking from multiple perspectives and return to the same characters on both sides of the border back and forth. And also looking a little bit into history. I know the historical chapter is sort of long and it's only in the beginning, but I think that one is especially important to understand how we got here.
That's great. Yeah, I wanted to emphasize for our listeners that one of the things that's great about this book is as you say, the braiding of these different stories. So there's a sort of, I don't know, maybe it's 6 or so characters that you go into quite deeply, including a journalist, including someone who's very interested in purchasing guns to protect his family in Monterrey, a whole range of different people. And the way that you kind of interleave that with some of the not just the historical stuff, but some really complicated legal things that you explain really clearly. And so this is really some of the strengths of the piece.
I hope we get a chance to talk about the methods a lot because I really love your note on methods. And at the end, you do talk about your, not allergy, but your hesitancy to quantify, to turn people into numbers. But you begin with some really startling numbers. So you begin by talking about the number of murders committed annually in Mexico as compared to the United States, that there are 35,000. There were in 2019. There were 35,000 murders in Mexico. In the United States, there were only 16,000. So the ratio of murders is something like 28 people murdered per 100,000 in Mexico, as opposed to only 5 in the United States. Those are really compelling numbers, especially when you consider how many of those murders are committed by the guns that you are cataloging the way that they are trafficked into the U.S. So could I ask you about starting out with numbers, despite, as Elizabeth said, your commitment to the braided stories, to the deep history, but that's a stark and arresting set of numbers you begin with.
And actually, before you answer, can I just add another pair of numbers that you present at the beginning along with these, which is the number of gun stores in U.S. states bordering Mexico, 9,940. Number of gun stores in Mexico, 2.
And recently just 1, right? I mean, just became 2. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
So, yes, that's a really good question because numbers, it seems easier to talk about gun violence through numbers, but also because you can get them through some public information, records requests, for example, and they seem very tangible. And numbers were something I could get when it was difficult to find people who wanted to talk to me. So I was, one route of doing this research was really becoming obsessed with the numbers. Even though as an anthropologist, an anthropologist who studies illicit economies, I know that, most of these numbers are very inaccurate representations for what we are talking about. Yes, murders, somewhat maybe more accurate. In the United States, that number is so low because in the United States, gun suicides outnumber gun homicides. So if we added that, the number of gun deaths would be similar, but it's another question.
Wow.
The number of gun stores, yes, the difference between almost 10,000 and 1 and now 2 is stark, but even the 10,000, these are brick and mortar federally licensed gun dealerships. And that's a lot of gun sales happen privately in the back of, the truck in front of Walmart or gun shows.
Or ghost guns.
Or ghost guns. Yeah. So I want, because numbers play such a huge role in policy and in media representations as well, I wanted them to be there and think with them, but always take them with a grain of salt. And that the numbers I present in the beginning that you cited, they are if you read Harper's magazine, they always have this Harper's Index that very, very, very pointedly kind of summarize the reality of certain issues in the United States. So I was inspired by that.
Yeah, and it comes through because it, like those Harper's Index, it's a very particular genre that juxtaposes things really carefully. So it's numbers as a story, kind of.
Exactly.
Which I think is a great way to start as well. Yeah. Let me ask you, you talked about, for instance, how a journalist is one of the stories that you focus on. And so for those of you who are listening, Ieva's other work has focused her first book, which is called Savage Frontier, which is located in the an area of 3 borders in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. Looked a lot at journalists and the ways in which journalists kind of stepped in and did some of the work of the state and some of the work of how borders were managed, both legally and illegally, in quotation marks. And your second book, Thresholds, does something in some ways similar, but around emergency responders. And then here we have this kind of very interesting figure of the journalist who's sort of like you, but different from you also. Can you think a little bit about like how this plays in your work more generally?
So I've obviously been thinking a lot about that. And I think for me as an anthropologist, or for maybe anthropologists in more general sense, journalists are like our doppelgangers. At least for me, a journalist is my doppelganger. And that was one of the reasons I wanted Juan to be there, because in my first book, so there is this through line that continues, I think, through all my books. I'm very interested in how we decide where this boundary between legal and illegal is, or what is crime and what is justified state forms of violence, because it's part of the monopoly. So journalists in my first book, they were the ones that made certain trafficking of drugs primarily, but certain border violence and crime legible. In the second book, was focused on emergency responders. They embodied the state, but they also saw the most bodily ways the state wounds people, migrants who are crossing the border. So in this book, it's kind of a continuation, because I'm focusing on the this kind of already exceeds your question about journalism, but I was interested in the object. But the journalists who are trying to tell these stories, they also play with the same numbers and they follow the same objects and try to tell the same story. So there is this parallel that's happening that was interesting on the narrative and conceptual level, but also thinking about like methods, what John asked before, and pragmatically doing part of this work together with the journalist was the only way I could do it.
Right. And at the same time, you must have been very aware of the degree of danger that it is for journalists working on these topics in Mexico, and how that related to what you could or couldn't do.
Yeah, I think it was a way of sharing the danger, because it was the Juan specifically, this person who is a character in my book. He's in a government protection program. He's received threats. So for him, I've done other things with him after this book. I sometimes co-sign articles as a way to deflect danger to him, because I am much safer in the United States as a U.S. citizen. At the same time, he also deflects danger from me when I go to those communities where I don't really know how to recognize the risks.
Sure. Yeah.
I love your Charles Tilly quote about the state as protection racket. And I really appreciate your answer about, I was going to ask you about the EMT first responders book as well. But so if I understand you, your point is to see the state in its kind of multivalent role as having, like in a situation where it doesn't really have a monopoly on violence. So how you understand like state actors in that.
I even used this concept. It's not really a very fancy concept, but violence workers. Like in order to people who work for organized crime groups in Mexico, people who work for the military or the police who are part of the state, they all use guns. Yeah. They all perform certain security functions.
Yeah.
And if
non-monopolistic violence. Yeah.
If we strip off this this kind of designation that this violence is legitimate because it belongs to the state and this one is not, it's illegal.
Yeah.
Like what can we really understand? Because as Tilly said, like what states do effectually, it is basically a protection racket with advantage of legitimacy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I connect that, if this is okay, Elizabeth? Can we talk about the plaza, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, like that concept of a zone that's jurisdictionally under the sway of, I'm not going to say the noun because I know the noun is debatable, but a cartel, an organized group. I mean, is that an instance of a case where you can see the quirks of this, the multiple kinds of violence worker who are in this space?
I guess so. I like that question. So plaza is very descriptive the way we usually think about it. It's a town square.
Yeah.
But for these organized crime groups, yes, they fight over plaza as the territory that needs to be controlled. And usually in these plazas, violence happens when there is competition, whether it is from different groups or whether a particular group in the state. So through, I think it's like the territorial expression of what we are talking about in terms of violence. Yeah.
I think it also, let me see if I can express this clearly because I just thought of it. But, you were talking about sort of your interest in legality and illegality through all of these works that you've done. And I think that's what attracts you to the border, right? I mean, the border is sort of where these things become made manifest in particular kinds of ways, and the sort of juxtaposition of different orders that are making claims to their legality. In a sense, that's what the plaza, that sort of, it's almost like a fractal thing, right? Where it's sort of like the same thing is happening in the supposedly illegal, at the illegal scale that happens at the legal scale with borders, something like that.
I love the fractal analogy. Exactly.
Yeah.
But just to press that point about violence as a product, are you saying that violence is a product of the moments when it's like illegible or debatable or contestable who controls it? Because that makes me think something like, these mafia neighborhoods, like supposedly in Brooklyn, there are still neighborhoods where there's no street crime because everybody knows who's in charge. It's not the police, but somebody's in charge. Therefore, there's no violence. So,
well, this is where we need to talk about what we mean by violence because yes, there is when there is clear control by one group or including the state, there might not be brutal attacks and shootouts and killings. But as anthropologists, we know that there is structural violence and that there are basically the question of this book for me was like how to understand how is violence produced, because violence is produced legally and materially. So we're thinking about different laws, what is made a crime and what is not, who can have a gun and who can't, what kind of gun, but also who makes the guns, what kind of guns, so like who makes the ammunition, how does that ammunition get into the car and across the border. So there are like these various layers of the production of violence, and then we also have like symbolic production of violence, which I don't talk much about in the book, but we have the narconovelas and narcocorridos and this whole like symbolic world around the mafia.
So I was thinking it's such a fascinating topic to think about these, the sort of scalar property in a neighborhood, the way in which, there can be sort of local forms of peace versus the larger governmental forms, and thinking about it in Northern Ireland, or thinking about it maybe even in like thinking about Hamas and Hamas's form of governmentality in Gaza as opposed to the West Bank. It just feels like there's really interesting models there for what it means to have a plaza, basically. I mean,
absolutely.
As a category.
There was another book that actually I read at Brandeis right here in Elizabeth's seminar, Alan Feldman's Formations of Violence, which is about Northern Ireland, and it is about the paramilitaries and the IRA and how they negotiate space and mark bodies
and also how people, I was just thinking that too, how people negotiate space themselves. And I think that really speaks to what you were just saying about sort of how does violence get produced and what is violence? Because it's not only I'm not trying to say this is not important, but it's the matter of structural violence, but it's also, violence in the form of, well, you can't go there. You can't go to this place or that place, or you can't take this job or that job, right? Those are also forms of constraint that are not structural in the same sense that we typically think of, and not, putting a gun to your head, but, are constraining what you can do.
Because
you
don't go there.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And thinking about Gaza, well, there is the Jerusalem. There is a great book by Nathan Thrall, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, which brings me back to Threshold, because it is very much about borders and walls and who can get emergency care and where violence from the state neglect or too much of the state occurs. but also, yeah, definitely guns are part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I did really like this aspect of the book when you talk about the specific kind of, both in both Mexico and the United States, guns are a constitutional protection, and people have lots of sort of, sentimental or personal or cultural things that they project onto guns. But the U.S. has like a really specific formulation around being a certain kind of American man. I think mostly man, maybe also women too, and the right to bear arms. So that part of it, I'm curious if you want to say anything more about that here, because I think that was such an important part of the difficulty of unraveling this problem, right?
Yeah, I think United States is so unique in our attachment to guns and gun culture, even compared to other countries where guns are very prominent, whether it's Israel or Switzerland. It's a lot of it has to do with how guns from practical tools have become part of this narrative, as you say, like narrative of the frontier and freedom and masculine style of power. That was basically...
And personal autonomy, too, that it's a sign of personal autonomy that's under threat.
Yeah, but that was all used by gun companies in their advertising. Mexico, for example, doesn't allow gun advertising. So even in Safari International magazines, you can find vests or boots, but you will not see images of firearms. So the fact that it's such a big business in the United States and there is a lobby behind it, I think makes us think that we should take it for granted, but there is now another gun culture in the United States emerging of how many people have been traumatized by gun violence, whether it's in school shootings or in other scenarios. But that's also not where most gun violence in the United States occurs. Most gun violence happens in inner city neighborhoods, and it involves handguns, and it's not the kind of violence we rally around. So it's I think when we talk about U.S. gun culture, we need having a cross-cultural analysis and comparison.
Yes,
really helps us see how bizarre our attachment to them are.
I like that point, but also in terms of the cross-border work that you're doing, you end by visiting a Smith & Wesson factory in Springfield. And so we all live in Massachusetts, and I think we think of it as like a kind of gun-unfriendly state, comparatively speaking. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you don't agree with that. But, I think of it as a place where there actually are gun laws. But you wanted to bring home some of the same things that people who did analysis of, like, the production of slave clothing or shackles before the Civil War, which were all manufactured in New England, so that New England was anti-slave, but nonetheless shipping down the implements of its
profiting from.
Yeah. I mean, it was good old capitalism in action. So I was wondering about your decision to end with the Smith & Wesson factory. I liked that choice.
It was it sort of happened chronologically for me too. I was already writing the book, and I thought I don't know how to end it. It doesn't have a conclusion. So let me go somewhere where it all began. And it wasn't very far, from Cambridge to drive to Springfield. And also, back when I was in the field, when I was in Mexico, when I was told to shoot that Smith & Wesson M&P 15, which is an AR-15 style rifle, I did not somehow connect it that these are made in Massachusetts. I knew the history, Connecticut and Colt and Smith & Wesson here, but it felt so detached from what was happening in Mexico. At the same time, my whole book is not about the connection and not the detachment. So I wanted to go back to the roots. You can't really visit the factory anymore because of protests, and now they all shut down, and they are moving a lot of production of rifles because Massachusetts is not very friendly to production of semi-automatic rifles, so they're moving that out of state.
I just want to flag one thing you said a second ago because I think it's very politically important. what you said about, you can't advertise guns in Mexico, because, one of the things I think is very effective about the book and really important right now is to kind of disrupt the idea that, well, it's in Mexico that there's no legality and people are crazy down there and they're shooting each other, right? One of the things that I was really struck by, and we can maybe, I don't know if you want to ask more about methods, but I think this is a method question as well, is the rhetoric of our president-elect and others of a kind of southern border really, creates this notion that, there's this sort of bastion of security and legality in the United States, and it's under threat from the South, right, as a kind of really militarized. But, the southern border is also a northern border, and there's also a threat going south. In fact, in some ways, equally, certainly equally illegal from the perspective of Mexico and equally damaging. So I just really appreciated that. And
Thank you. No, that was very important for me. Because, yes, in our public narratives, we describe Mexico as a violent country, and refugees and migrants who come here, they might bring that violence, but we don't somehow connect the dots that it is our guns that make that violence, that then people are fleeing. But also historically looking, and from Mexico, for Mexico, yes, the northern border is a threat because it was the United States that chopped off a huge chunk of its territory, invaded Mexico several times. Now it's sending the guns, and this is where the demand for drugs is. So
Pity poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States.
Yes. No, don't usually quote dictators, but this Porfirio Diaz's quote is very apt.
Yes. Also very good at Danzón, they said.
Maybe we could get into that as an ethnographic question as well for you. I was really struck. I mean, you actually refer to literature and could kind of weave in and out of sort of writerly encounters in ways that I love. But you quoted Alice Munro at a moment when I wasn't necessarily thinking of it. So if I could just put it in, if I can just read that to you. Okay. In my previous work, despite occasional disagreements on matters both political and personal, we shared core values and deep commitments to serving the community. But, in this book, quote, such camaraderie wasn't possible when I began hanging out with people who engaged in violence, but nor could I close myself off. Writer Alice Munro called it the pain of human contact. Ethnography is often painful this way. So as a non-anthropologist, can you tell us, because most of our listeners, I think, probably are also non-anthropologists. Sorry, Elizabeth. But can you talk more about that? It's a fascinating insight.
Yes, thank you for that question. So ethnography, there are so many definitions. I really like calling ethnography deep hanging out, or what in textbooks you would call participant observation, but it is spending a lot of time with people. And yes, we do interviews, but most interesting things happen between those interviews. It's these informal conversations and just following people throughout the day. But what does that mean when you do that for a very long time? Well, you establish relationships with people, you become friends, or you become enemies. So I think what Alice Munro quote helped me say is that ethnography, it can be extremely gratifying and enriching experience, but it also bruises you very heavily. That connection to other people, and because unlike in my previous work where I was part of this firefighter and paramedic community, and we disagreed on some political things, but we eventually shared core values. These people, most of them, the gun users and gun smugglers and members of organized crime, it was difficult to spend so much time with them and begin to care about them and know that I can never completely trust them and they could never completely trust me. Like, these are people whose job is to kidnap others for ransom.
Right.
But for them, it was me whose job it could be to share this information with law enforcement or with the journalists. So they could never entirely trust me. I could never trust them, and we still had to live together for a long time.
You used the word bruising. Is it? I was thinking what you're describing was the pain of separation at the end, but you're talking about something more intimate than that. It's not just that. I mean, that you have these relationships and then you break them. That's one thing, but this is something more.
Yeah,
ongoing.
I think it leaves an imprint on your body, not just the human connections that you form in ethnography, but just the field work itself.
Yeah, and I think in your case, and I in a much less kind of dramatic way, but and when I do field work with bankers or people who are believe that that we should go back to a gold standard, or other people, I feel some of this too, because on some level, you have to create a bond because it's entirely voluntary, of course, that people, they don't have to talk to you, nor would you want them to feel that they have to talk to you. They talk to you or let you hang out with them because it's in some way comfortable for them to do so, or acceptable, or just, that they enjoy it or something. So there's this constant contradiction, right? Because you're sort of wanting to build that bond, and yet the things that you're often looking for to talk about are precisely the things that make you fundamentally opposed.
Yeah, and it's I think also complicated because is my curiosity about these people, like what kind of person am I?
Right.
Sometimes I begin asking that question. So it can cut deep.
Yeah.
Right. And where can you say or not say what you really think too? Right?
I mean, it's not about complicity, but it might be implication. Is that a word, or is it more like just involvement? I don't know. It's.
Yeah, I mean, maybe some level of complicity too. Yeah, why not?
You use the word, or you quote the word by some anthropologist, Deborah Thomas. You quote the word responsible. That was really interesting. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so Deborah Thomas, her book is about Jamaica and various forms of political violence in Jamaica, and she writes. She also has another term called witnessing 2.0, and the idea.
I like responsible.
the idea of responsible is connected to that, because it is the type. So maybe we can also say what ethnographers do is like we witness what is happening, but what she argues that how do we write about and think about it in a way that's makes us responsible and response-able. That is, we both kind of admit to our complicity in existing power structures, maybe forms of violence, extraction of knowledge and information, just like various levels, but also act from that. Like we become able to respond to what's going on.
Yeah.
My students love that idea of responsible and witnessing 2.0, and they love this premise that Deborah Thomas writes about. I think it's easier to say than to do.
Yeah.
Yes. But it gives you a ground to stand on, kind of, from which to act.
Yeah.
Potentially. Yeah. Maybe this is a moment to switch to talking about, you have a really great reflection at the end, and it's something that anybody who writes about these topics has to confront, about how to write about violence, sometimes really, frightening, terrible acts, and in a way that isn't so sensationalizing, or that doesn't flatten the people that are there, or doesn't, and this is a related thing, but not maybe exactly the same thing, doesn't accept certain kinds of categories of how the conflict should be thought about. You want to tell us how you came to that and what your...
That was... I think I was thinking about how to write this book and writing about it simultaneously, obviously. But it was almost tricky to the point where I had to ask myself a question: would writing this book do more harm than good because it risks reproducing certain tropes? At the same time, the obvious answer is no, because in the United States we don't acknowledge the guns that are going south in Mexico. So I wanted to kind of dismantle and challenge that kind of narrative, but how to do it in a way that wouldn't I don't know. I think that the balance is the most difficult question, right? And I was reading all of these writers who were thinking and writing about violence. I read Yuri Herrera. So Yuri Herrera was very important to me because he very thoughtfully says that he will not use certain words when he writes about migration and the border. It's more difficult for a nonfiction writer as an anthropologist to completely avoid terms like cartel or narco or sicario. I try to do that. But I think it's more than just not sensationalizing in content and in selection of words. I wanted to create a mood. So when you close a book and when you close a chapter, something sometimes stays with you and other times does not. So, for example, I wanted it to unsettle people, but not overdo it. And again, like, I'm the writer, so what do I know? It's only the readers who can tell me whether it worked or not.
Actually, you had a reflection really early on. Like, I agree with Elizabeth about the methods note as being the place where I really got your points about proximity and also how to think about refusal, how to think about just, the situations in which you would and wouldn't be able to talk to people. But early on, you said, finding a sincere voice of my own has not been easy. As an ethnographer working in proximity to violence, I've learned to use language as personal protective equipment. PPE, we all know that now. Akin to the gloves and masks we donned as paramedics caring for the sick and injured, a shield insulating me from the brutal reality I witnessed. I hesitated to take it off. So I have just a simple question. Are you talking about the language you use to write this book, or are you talking about how you used language when you were in the situations, or both?
I mean, this is such a good question. I am very happy I wrote that, but I really appreciate that you picked up on it. So it's multiple layers, right? Because violence is it's notoriously difficult to communicate if we're talking about, like torture, or it just shatters language. So already that, right? But then, so the PPE or the protective equipment, I needed some kind of distance from that reality that I'm describing. I needed distance actually geographically too. I needed to come back to the United States to write about it. It was very difficult to write anything in Mexico. I needed a different language. So most of the research was done in Spanish in Mexico. But my thinking about it, I think even translating it into English was already creating another distance and another layer of between me and those experiences. Not only what I saw, what I heard, what other people told me, but like from that whole reality. But then...
So a buffer.
A buffer. Yeah, I would say a buffer. And then, I mean, you can also think about gloves maybe as other metaphors, like you use gloves when you go to the archives, or when you treat very, sensitive things. So then you
forensic examination.
Forensic, yeah. But I thought that language was that layer between me and the experiences, right, and the stories.
So that point about, switching to writing in a different language and giving yourself some distance is great. Though, again, I think the fact that you ended with visiting a factory in Springfield is interesting in that context, in terms of like wanting to go away, but how far away can you actually go? But can you say more? You said there was something that your students really, there was a set of things that your students really liked learning, which is, well, you probably have it, but let me get, patience, persistence, and humility. And I guess the question of taking no for an answer is related to that. Eventually taking no for an answer is what I heard you saying.
Absolutely. I mean, going back to memories of graduate school, I don't think I learned methods very well. I don't think you can learn methods in the classroom.
Yeah.
You
Interesting.
learn through experience. And I have been recently teaching a lot of ethnographic research methods, and I thought, how can I convey the experience that it actually is and what it takes? And patience, yes, it takes a lot of patience. There are a lot of people who say no, a lot of people who don't respond, and you kind of have to stick around and kind of prove them that you really care. You're not there for a quote, right?
Yeah.
Persistence, very much the same. Go and knock on the door again and again and again. And what was the last one? Oh, humility. That was super important.
Yeah.
Nobody owes you the story or the answer. You have to show to other people that you're really interested in hearing it.
Right.
And if they want, they can share it. And if they don't, yes, you take the refusals. I had a lot of people who, for obvious reasons, they were afraid to talk to me because there was not that trust, both in the government and on the other side of the law. And it's always hard to balance. So where does your persistence end and you begin accepting refusal?
Yeah.
And obviously, looking back, this book now exists. It's a thing. It's not me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it. It's out in the world. But I sometimes wonder whether I accepted too many refusals, whether I could have been more persistent to pursue certain stories. There are things I didn't include in the book because I was concerned about legal repercussions and other kinds of things, but also, the safety thing, things I didn't do because I was afraid. I listened to my fear.
Although you are here to tell the tale, so that's a good sign.
Yes, that's true.
And I think you also make a point about people in situations where their lives can't be fully narratable to them. That's where you quote Arendt in terms of the sheer happening of a situation of enormity.
Right.
I think she's talking about the Holocaust, but a situation in which one can experience and report on things that happen but not put them into order. But you strove to order them in your book. Although in a certain sense, there's something about the structure of your book that's also you're keeping it a bit open as well, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these chapters do not go together the way a public policy book's chapters would go.
No, they don't. I don't think it has a clear beginning or a clear end. It's sort of you are stuck in these circles, or a vicious circle of violence, right, between U.S. and Mexico.
Especially at the ending, you have kind of two endings. Right?
Yeah.
You sort of have a more kind of optimistic sort of ending, and then that doesn't seem to be quite enough for you, and the final ending is more
sincere.
It's not pessimistic only, or that's not its dominant sort of mood, but it's more open.
Well, because one of the things people always ask is, so what can I do? A student comes up, so what can I do to make this better? So I thought I owe it to them to at least think through some of those answers, even though it's a big caveat, I don't know whether we can achieve it, but we can work, towards that goal. But meanwhile, look what's happening here with Smith & Wesson producing rifles faster than I can write this book.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway for you in terms of what you want your next project to look like? Do you know yet?
Oh, yes, I'm deep in the throes of my next project. And it's very much a continuation. This book emerged from my last one. Now I am doing a project on extraditions and on whether justice can be exported from Mexico to the United States. So it's still very much about the two of these countries together, about law and justice and violence and a big mess.
All right. Well, maybe this is the moment to turn to our final segment, which is called Recallable Books. And this is where we each think about something. It could be a book or a film. It could be whatever you'd like to bring in that builds on this conversation, and maybe our listeners might want to check out if they wanted to go more in one direction or another. So usually we ask our guests to begin, and then John and I may have some.
Yeah,
to add.
and I will say, Ieva, you already began by sending us an amazing picture, which we will put up on the website of what I'm reading now.
Yeah.
It's like on our nightstand.
Or what I read in order to
Yeah, so we'll definitely post that for the kind of meta Recallable book.
Well, when I finished this book, I made these two pictures. The one was of the books I read for like more kind of background and information. So there were a lot of history books, a lot of journalist books. But then I made a picture of another book, of other books that were on the shelf all the time when I was writing this, that I sometimes looked for, inspiration. And there are like fiction and nonfiction books. Did I mention E.P. Thompson, Whigs and Hunters?
Not yet, but...
Not yet. That's super important.
Wait, say one more sentence about that. Why is that super important?
Well, because it's all about how law comes to be and how it is violent in when it works for the state, right? That book was amazing. It goes into these minute details about cutting off the heads of fish ponds and hunting deer in the King's Forest, and how what kind of penalties and like transportation or capital punishment, the Black Act. It's a brilliant book that really like inspired me in that, especially the history chapter, when I was focusing on how many bullets like they were confiscating and the guns they were confiscating and the but another book I really wanted to mention, which we didn't get to talk about, is Sven Lindqvist's A History of Bombing, and that's primarily because of form. Because that book is it's about bombing, but it's written in these short like segments that you can sort of follow your own story, like the shards of a bomb when it explodes, and you can kind of follow back and forth from Japan to Germany and here and there, and it's the form and the content go together in that book. It was very hard to do it with this book, thinking I wanted to think about entry and exit between U.S. and Mexico, entry bullet wounds and things like that. But in order for it to be a public book and readable also to policymakers, it couldn't be that creative in its content. That's my editor said.
Well, the thing that I wanted to bring in does also speak to the form of your book, although it's similar in content. It's a film called Border South, which also talks about this time moving from south to north, the passage of migrants up to and across the border. I think there's something very, very cognate in the ways in which that film tells different braided stories. There's also one character within it who's an anthropologist, Jason De Leon, and that anthropologist is kind of within the frame of migrants and other actors, somewhat in the same way in which Juan, the journalist, is sort of this is somebody who's also part of the story, and that the guns are also bringing journalism, journalists in the same way in which we see in Border South. And also, I think that film really humanizes the characters, the people. They're not fictional characters; they're actual people, and shows them as people who are in extraordinary circumstances, but in many ways who are very ordinary and who have, who play with a dog, who's near the fire where they're sitting, or who have, jokes and stories and, just are endeavoring to live their lives under very difficult conditions. And that came through a lot in your work as well. So.
All right, so I had a bunch of Recallable books that I managed to slip in there. I'm so glad you mentioned Blood Meridian, too, because I was thinking about that a lot in terms of this question of the plaza and then also the notion of the zone, this space of state of exception or site of suspended lawlessness. I was thinking a lot about Agamben and those sort of, whether we ever really have fully exceptional deterritorialized spaces. And but I think so I was going to talk about Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, because he has this concept of the zone, which he thinks of basically all of Europe post-45 for this brief moment is a zone like that, just kind of an expanded, like a balloon inflating, and what is left inside it. It's like the air hasn't had time to go all the way in. But the more I heard you talk about the plaza and the kind of question of, who has a monopoly on violence or differential monopoly, I kind of come back to Milkman. I mean, I do think that Anna Burns' novel is really about, these spaces where it's not that there's no control, it's that the control has shifted. And instead of it being a set of abstract institutions, it's like this very physical object, like who is holding the gun. So that novel begins and ends with somebody holding a gun to someone else's chest. And so that's how I'll be thinking about this conversation.
Okay, well, the only thing left is to thank you so much, Ieva, for joining us. It's really been such a pleasure.
Oh, no, the pleasure is all mine. It's like coming home.
And
thank you very much. It was great. Yeah.
And also to thank our listeners. It's been like coming home for me to be here as a host again.
I know. I don't want to open the booth. Here we all are.
Yeah.
We've got our coffee.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon, I'm sure. Yeah. And to recommend to you several recent episodes from Recall This Book, both a series that we've launched since the election called What Just Happened, with visitors including Vincent Brown and Mark Blythe. And a series on Recall This Story, most recently with Ivan Kraulkamp on Sylvia Townsend Warner's Fox Castle. So without further ado, have a wonderful afternoon and see you next time.
Thanks.
Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.